90 miles. That's all that separates the American coastline from what military analysts are now calling the most dangerous intelligence operation ever built in the Western Hemisphere. And the terrifying part, it's been quietly expanding for years, while most Americans had no idea it even existed. Before we go further, if this kind of deep, daily geopolitical analysis matters to you, hit that like button right now. It helps this reach people who need to see it. A few years ago, a bombshell report surfaced claiming that a massive electronic eavesdropping facility was being planned on the island of Cuba. The price tag, several billion dollars. That number immediately raised a red flag. Cuba's economy is in freefall. Food, fuel, and medicine have become luxuries on that island. Blackouts last for days. Hospitals run without supplies. So the obvious question became, who exactly is footing the bill? And when that answer surfaced, everything about America's vulnerability in its own backyard suddenly made horrifying sense. The rumors about Chinese intelligence activity in Cuba had been circulating since the 1990s. For decades, they were dismissed. Background noise, conspiracy theory fodder. Then in June 2023, the Wall Street Journal published a report that changed everything. China and Cuba had secretly agreed to allow Beijing to construct a full-scale electronic eavesdropping facility on Cuban soil. Its explicit purpose was to intercept communications across the southeastern United States. Both governments initially denied it. Within days, American officials quietly confirmed it was real and had been operational since at least 2019. If that's what they admitted to, pause for a second and ask yourself, what haven't they told us yet? Stay with me, because what comes next is even more unsettling. Researchers at the Center for Strategic and International Studies used commercial satellite imagery to identify 4 specific intelligence sites inside Cuba. What they found was not subtle. Massive antenna fields, radomes, space tracking equipment, all expanded and upgraded in recent years. The locations, Calabazar, El Salado, and most critically, Bejucal, less than 10 miles from where the Soviet Union once ran its legendary Lord Signals intelligence station during the Cold War. And in satellite images from April 2025, something new had appeared at Bejucal, a circular antenna array, perfectly constructed, stretching roughly 175 meters across, nearly the size of 1.5 football fields. No missiles, no warheads. But analysts say this single structure may be more strategically dangerous than either. Don't go anywhere, because understanding what this antenna actually does will completely change how you see this conflict. And if this level of daily analysis is what you've been looking for, consider subscribing. We break stories like this every single day. This is not a decorative dish array. It is a high-frequency direction-finding system capable of pinpointing the exact origin of radio signals from up to 8,000 nautical miles away. From Cuban soil, that range covers the entire continental United States, large sections of the Atlantic, and deep into the Pacific. Using this system, China can monitor American naval exercises in real time, track military and commercial vessels moving through the Caribbean, harvest radar and telemetry data from American missile tests, and, most alarmingly, detect the burst communications sent by American submarines. Submarines exist because they are invisible. Their entire strategic value is built on silence. If China can locate them from Cuba, that changes the entire military equation in any future conflict. Admiral Alvin Holsey told Congress directly in early 2025 that Beijing is actively exploiting Cuba for intelligence collection against the United States, calling it one of his top operational concerns. The second major site, identified near Havana, has been described by analysts as a fire hose of intelligence data impossible to replicate from anywhere else on Earth. It appears specifically designed to capture satellite communications, intercept military signals, and collect telemetry from space launches out of Cape Canaveral in Florida. Other sites in eastern Cuba sit in direct line of sight with the U.S. naval base at Guantanamo Bay. Even when communications are encrypted, the patterns alone carry enormous value. Who is calling whom? How often? At what volume? At what time? These patterns reveal military readiness and operational intent without decrypting a single word. None of this happened by accident. The China-Cuba relationship goes back to the 1960s, when Cuba became the first Latin American country to officially recognize the People's Republic of China. Cuban leadership, starting with Fidel Castro, gave Beijing political legitimacy at a time when much of the world refused to acknowledge it existed. Cuba supported the One China policy, endorsed Beijing's controversial anti-secession law on Taiwan, backed the Hong Kong national security law, and has consistently defended China at the United Nations on every sensitive issue that matters to Beijing. In return, China provided economic lifelines, political cover, and something far more consequential, a permanent foothold in the Western Hemisphere, 90 miles from American soil. And there's one figure whose survival defined this entire relationship. He once said, and this is a direct quote, "If surviving assassination attempts were an Olympic event, I would win the gold medal." The CIA reportedly attempted to kill him 638 times. Every attempt failed. Fidel Castro died in 2016 at the age of 90 from natural causes. Cuba's loyalty to Beijing outlived him. Cuba's strategic value to China is not limited to spying. Cuba holds the fifth largest nickel reserves on the planet, roughly 6% of all known global supply, sitting alongside significant cobalt deposits. These are not just industrial metals, they are the essential ingredients in the batteries powering the global electric vehicle revolution. China controls approximately 70% of global EV manufacturing capacity and over 80% of lithium iron phosphate battery output. That industrial machine runs on a guaranteed supply of high-purity nickel, and Cuba represents a critical backup source. For years, Canadian company Sherritt International dominated Cuba's nickel sector through a major joint venture. By early 2026, Cuba's collapsing economy had made operations nearly impossible. Cuba owed Sherritt over $107 million in frozen payments it could not repay. As Western interests withdrew, Chinese state-owned enterprises moved directly in. By April 2026, Chinese sedimentation tanks and leaching equipment were already being installed at Cuban processing facilities. Cuban state media called it technological modernization. Analysts called it what it actually was, a structural takeover of Cuba's most valuable natural resource. The surveillance layer runs even deeper. Because of the American embargo, Cuba never had access to Western telecommunications companies. No Ericsson, no Nokia, nothing from the West. So Cuba's state telecom monopoly turned entirely to Chinese suppliers, Huawei, ZTE, TP-Link. By 2025, Huawei and ZTE servers sat inside Cuba's main network nodes. Huawei fiber crisscrossed the island's broadband infrastructure. ZTE mobile base stations were deployed across Havana, Santiago, Santa Clara, and in sensitive military zones. Even Cuba's main undersea cable connecting the island to Venezuela was built using Chinese equipment. The Swedish organization Curium and the Open Observatory of Network Interference both independently discovered that Huawei's site management software was being actively used in Cuba to filter searches, block content, and track user activity in real time, cutting off communications in specific geographic zones whenever the government decided to. Cuba now has its own version of China's Great Firewall, built and installed by the same companies. When student protests erupted in June 2025 over extreme mobile data price hikes, the government's response was immediate. Use the Chinese-installed network to shut down mobile internet in the protest zones. The same tactic deployed in 2021 and again in March 2026. China has not stopped at surveillance and resources. In 2025, Cuba's banks officially joined China's cross-border interbank payment system, Beijing's direct alternative to the SWIFT financial network, specifically engineered to process transactions that American sanctions cannot block. Chinese companies have expressed active interest in Cuba's Mariel Special Development Zone, its oil exploration sector, and its sugar industry. On the energy front, Cuba's solar energy share jumped from 5.8% to over 20% in just 12 months by March 2026. Beijing has committed to constructing 92 solar parks across the island by 2028, with a combined generation capacity of 2 gigawatts, roughly equal to everything Cuba currently produces from fossil fuels. But Cuba is not becoming energy independent. It is becoming energy dependent on China instead. Every panel, every grid management system, every battery storage unit deepens that dependency. And in March 2026, Cuba's entire national power grid collapsed. Not partially, entirely. The stated cause was a US-led fuel blockade following American disruption of Venezuelan oil exports to Cuba. The grid, already on its last legs, simply gave out. Trump's return to the White House accelerated the pressure dramatically. His administration explicitly framed its policy as total pressure on the Cuba-China axis. A new executive order significantly tightened sanctions. Venezuelan oil to Cuba was severed. American officials began openly speculating about the Cuban regime's imminent collapse. China's response was to double down. In February 2026, Foreign Minister Wang Yi met his Cuban counterpart in Beijing and stated directly that China firmly supports Cuba in safeguarding its national sovereignty against external interference. In late March, Beijing's foreign ministry repeated full support and rejected any attempt to deny Cuba its right to development. These are not diplomatic pleasantries. These are calculated signals to Washington that Cuba is a line Beijing will not allow to be crossed. To back those words, China delivered 60,000 tons of rice and an $80 million aid package for Cuba's collapsed electrical grid. China now accounts for over 20% of Cuba's total foreign trade. In March 2026, veteran political commentator Gordon Chang published a striking essay titled, "China is About to Lose Its Cuban Military Bases." His argument, Cuba's economic catastrophe has become so extreme that Havana might eventually be willing to trade Chinese intelligence facilities for American sanctions relief if Washington applied the right combination of pressure and incentives. It is a compelling thesis, but most analysts are skeptical. Cuba's leadership has survived over 6 decades of American embargo without changing course. Increased pressure has historically driven Havana closer to Beijing and Moscow, not toward Washington. And there is a deeper structural problem with the entire concept of China simply vacating Cuba. Most of what Beijing has built there is not a traditional military installation. It is woven into civilian life. Telecom networks, fiber cables, solar grids, port infrastructure. Removing it would not be a clean withdrawal. It would be an unraveling of systems that ordinary Cubans depend on every single day. And even if the most visible spy infrastructure faced enough pressure to be formally shut down, the underlying intelligence sharing agreements between Cuban and Chinese services could continue operating quietly, preserving most of the strategic value while simply making China's footprint less visible to satellites and journalists. China is constantly watched across the South China Sea. American spy planes, satellites, and naval vessels track its movements daily. Cuba gives Beijing the ability to return that favor at America's own front door. Analysts call this mutual espionage. It fundamentally shifts the balance of information advantage between the world's two most powerful nations. The United States is hardening its own communications, pushing alternative vendors into regional telecom networks, stepping up naval patrols around Cuba, and publicly monitoring Chinese intelligence activity on the island. But the infrastructure China has already embedded runs deep, and removing it will take years, if it can be removed at all. Here is where this stands right now. China has built an intelligence empire 90 miles from American soil. It controls Cuba's communications, is absorbing its natural resources, is powering its grid, and is keeping its government alive. The United States is running out of patience and running out of easy options. Whether Cuba's regime survives the current pressure, whether China holds its ground or is eventually forced to pull back, and whether this standoff escalates into something the world has not seen since 1962, none of that is settled. What is settled is this. The most consequential geopolitical battle of this decade is not being fought in the South China Sea or over Taiwan. It is being fought 90 miles from Florida, and most people still don't know it's happening. If you've made it this far, you already understand why this story matters more than almost anything else in the news cycle right now. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. Drop your take in the comments. Do you think China will hold Cuba, or is the regime finally entering its last chapter? And if you want this level of in-depth geopolitical analysis delivered to you every single day, not weekly, not occasionally, every day, then subscribing takes 2 seconds, and it means you'll never miss what's actually happening in the world.